Dominic Patterson's heart skipped when he arrived home unexpectedly early that Thursday. He never planned to witness what he saw in the backyard, but once he did, there was no turning back. The storm had ended just moments before. The sky still trembled with grey, and the patio stones gleamed wet under a quiet sun. Dominic hadn't meant to come home early. The meeting downtown had been cancelled at the last minute, and instead of heading back to the office, he'd told his driver to take him home. It wasn't like him. He rarely broke routine. But something about that afternoon, maybe the weight of silence in the car, maybe the memory of a dream he couldn't shake, pushed him to go back. And now, standing just inside the glass doors of his house, his breath caught in his throat. He heard it before he saw it. Laughter. Genuine, unfiltered, and wild. It was coming from outside. At first, Dominic thought it must have been the neighbors' kids, but then, as he stepped forward, he saw them, and his world cracked open. His 7-year-old son, Ryan, was outside in the backyard, walking, with forearm crutches, yes, and slowly. But walking. He was barefoot, stepping with careful focus into a puddle that shimmered beneath him. His t-shirt clung to him from sweat or rain, Dominic didn't know which. And in front of him, kneeling on the damp grass with a towel, was Nora King, the maid. She had been hired 3 weeks ago to clean floors and prepare guest rooms. That was it. Nothing more. But here she was, barefoot too, guiding Ryan's steps like a coach guiding a dancer, her hands steady, her voice soft and firm. "One more, yes, just like that," she whispered. "Proud chest, strong legs. You're doing it, baby, you're doing it." Ryan grinned, wide and unguarded. It was a look Dominic hadn't seen in years. Something warm and foreign tugged in his chest. What the hell was happening? Was this dangerous? Was she qualified? Why hadn't she asked permission? His mind raced with questions, none of them with answers. He didn't move. Couldn't. He stood like stone, staring through the glass. A part of him burned with fury. Another part, deep and unspoken, felt something much harder to name. Guilt. Maybe awe. The sky crackled softly overhead, and a breeze moved across the garden like a sigh. Nora didn't see him. She was focused entirely on Ryan, adjusting his stance with the towel beneath his foot, helping him balance in the slickness. She wasn't smiling in a performative way. She wasn't pretending. She was right there with him. Every shaky step. Dominic's fists clenched and unclenched by his sides. His jaw tightened. What gave her the right? And yet, what had given him the right to stop trying? For months, Ryan had barely spoken. He'd withdrawn after the accident, after Marissa died, after the funeral and the therapy, and the endless carousel of hired caretakers who came and went, each one more impersonal than the last. Dominic had poured millions into treatments, none of which had touched Ryan's spirit, and now here in the backyard, Ryan was walking, laughing, trusting, because of her. The maid. Dominic stepped back slowly, afraid to disrupt the moment. His hands trembled as they reached for the door handle. He didn't open it. He just watched. Before we continue, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe that nothing is impossible if only you believe. Later that evening, Dominic barely touched his dinner. He sat at the head of the long dining table, his tie loosened, a fork resting uselessly in his hand. Ryan had already gone to bed, exhausted but smiling, and Nora had quietly returned to the guest room hallway without a word. The image wouldn't leave him, her kneeling, his son laughing. And that sound, that wild belly-deep sound, it echoed in his head like music he hadn't known he missed. He rose from the table and poured himself a drink, something strong, and stood by the window looking out at the garden. The puddle was still there, reflecting the soft porch lights like glass. 9 caretakers in 6 weeks. None had gotten close to Ryan. Most had given up within days. One had claimed Ryan was emotionally unreachable, but Nora hadn't asked permission, hadn't waited for instruction. She'd just acted on instinct or impulse or something else entirely. He'd seen it on her face. She believed in Ryan, and Ryan believed in her. That thought hit him harder than expected. and deeper. Dominic set the glass down harder than he meant to. Liquid sloshed onto the counter. He had questions, and tomorrow morning he was going to get answers. Dominic set the glass down harder than he meant to. Liquid sloshed onto the counter. He had questions, and tomorrow morning he was going to get answers. But the morning didn't make things clearer. It made everything worse. His usual routine, espresso, emails, morning brief, unraveled before the first hour passed. The numbers on his screen blurred. His assistant's voice became background static. No matter how hard he tried to focus, his mind dragged him back to that soaked backyard and the sight of Ryan stepping barefoot into a puddle with Nora at his side. That laughter, that look in his son's eyes. He left the office by noon. Didn't tell anyone why. Didn't need to. Back at the house, the silence felt louder than usual. He moved through the halls like he didn't belong there, like he was intruding in his own home. Then he heard movement in the kitchen. Nora's voice, low, humming something familiar, something warm. He found her by the stove, chopping parsley on the cutting board. The smell of garlic and lemon drifted in the air. She was barefoot again. Dominic stood in the doorway, watching her. She turned slowly when she sensed him. "Mr. Patterson," she said calmly, hands still mid-motion. "I didn't expect you home so early." He didn't respond right away. He stepped into the room and folded his arms. "We need to talk." Nora met his gaze without flinching. Her expression didn't shift. No panic, no guilt, just quiet readiness. "I saw you yesterday," he said, "in the backyard, with Ryan." A pause, then a small nod. "I figured you had." "What were you doing?" His voice was tight. "Who told you to work with him like that?" "No one," she said. "I didn't ask permission." That much is obvious. "I didn't think I needed it. To help a child who wanted help." Dominic felt heat rise in his chest. "He's my son." Nora set the knife down gently. "Yes, and he trusts me." That cut deeper than he expected. He stepped forward, trying to keep control of his voice. "You're not licensed. You could have hurt him." She tilted her head slightly. "Actually, I am licensed. Masters in Pediatric Physical Therapy, Howard University, class of 2015, licensed in 3 states. He blinked. The air shifted. "That's not what's on your resume." "No," she said, "because no one ever calls back when it is." Dominic stared at her. She walked over to the sink and rinsed her hands, speaking as she moved. "I've applied to every children's hospital in Chicago, every private therapy clinic, every charter school. The interviews are polite, sometimes even enthusiastic, but they don't hire me, not with my last name, not with my zip code." She turned off the tap and dried her hands. "Eventually, I stopped waiting to be chosen. I took whatever work I could find. This house was one of the listings. Cleaning floors paid the bills." Dominic let out a slow breath, steadying his thoughts. "So you just decided to become my son's therapist?" Nora met his eyes. "No. I decided to see him." Silence. She stepped forward, folding the towel in her hands. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't make eye contact. He flinched when I got too close. But one morning I found his sketchbook left open on the patio table. Cars, wheels, movement. I complimented the drawings. He didn't answer, but the next day he left another one for me to find. Her voice was softer now. "That's how it started. Quiet things, eye contact, head nods. I never pushed him, never touched him, unless he asked. I earned it, slowly, and when I saw him trying to walk on his own, I offered to help." She set the folded towel down. "I used to run a clinic in D.C., small, community-based. It got defunded. After that, I lost my mum, lost custody of my little brother, came here for a new start. I didn't come to play savior. I came to survive." Dominic couldn't move. He had walked into this kitchen ready to fire her, to put up walls, to re-establish control, but all he felt now was small and humbled. Still, something in him resisted. "You still should have told me," he said. "I'm his father." Nora nodded once. "I know, and I thought about it. But I didn't think you'd listen." He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. "I saw the cameras," she added. "I know you watch." A pause. "I figured if I was wrong you'd stop it. But you didn't." She walked past him slowly, then stopped just behind him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes children don't need the most qualified. They need the most present." Dominic turned slowly. She didn't look away. He felt the weight of her words pressing into all the empty spaces he'd been trying to ignore for years. The grief, the shame, the absence he'd filled with work and logic and long silences. "I don't know whether to fire you or thank you," he said honestly. A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "You don't have to decide right now." She walked back to the counter, picking up the parsley again. Dominic stood there a moment longer. Then he left the kitchen without another word. But as he passed the hallway where Ryan's sketchbook lay open on the console table, he stopped. On the page, a boy in a puddle, a woman beside him, both smiling. And Dominic, watching from the window, drawn in careful pencil strokes, with the caption scrawled in a child's unsteady hand. "Miss Nora says I can fly." The next morning, Dominic didn't say anything. Not to Nora, not to Ryan. He just sat with his coffee a little longer, letting the hum of the house settle around him. Nora moved quietly in the background, preparing breakfast, humming to herself, asking Ryan what he wanted in his lunchbox. Dominic watched them both from behind his newspaper, but it wasn't detachment anymore. It was curiosity. Later that day, after Nora and Ryan left for the park, Dominic retreated to his office and pulled up the home security footage. The cameras had been installed after a break-in scare last winter, hidden well, looping silently into the cloud. He'd never had much reason to check them, until now. He scrolled back through the previous week. Morning routines started slowly, Nora arriving almost a full hour before her shift, letting herself in without a sound, setting her bag down, stretching her back like she'd done it 1,000 times. And then, soft knocks on Ryan's door. No words, just presence. The footage from 4 mornings ago showed her kneeling beside him on the carpet, helping him balance on one leg using a rolled-up sock. They were both in pajamas, his oversized, hers mismatched from sleep. Another day, she transformed the hallway runner into a path of balance challenges. Crumpled towels, couch cushions, even a pair of worn oven mitts, laid out like stepping stones. Ryan grinned through every wobble. When he fell, she applauded. When he succeeded, she didn't cheer. She nodded as if she always knew he would. It was makeshift therapy without the machines or white coats. And it was working. Dominic leaned closer to the screen. In the evening footage, Nora stayed after hours, sitting beside Ryan at the dining table as he sketched. He wasn't just doodling cars anymore. He was drawing movement, limbs in motion, figures jumping, walking, dancing. She'd ask questions. "What's the story here? Why is this one smiling?" And Ryan would answer, in whispers at first, then full sentences. Dominic hadn't heard him speak that much in months. He sat back in his chair, the weight of it all pressing deeper. This woman, this stranger, was unlocking something no therapist, no specialist, no school had managed to touch. And she was doing it with towels, drawings, and a patience that didn't ask for praise. The next day, Dominic didn't watch the footage. He watched in person. It was Saturday. He pretended to take a call by the patio doors, leaving them cracked just enough to hear. Nora and Ryan were in the backyard again. Today, she was using spoons, lining them in a zigzag across the grass. Ryan stepped over them one by one, arms out for balance. When he missed a step and kicked one, he laughed instead of freezing. "You're not breaking anything," she said. "You're learning." Dominic smiled without meaning to. He didn't remember the last time he'd seen his son laugh like that. Maybe before the accident, before the silence. He stepped closer, still unnoticed. Then he heard something that stopped him cold. Ryan said clearly, "Miss Nora, do you think I could climb stairs one day?" Nora didn't hesitate. "I think you'll do more than that." Later that night, Dominic couldn't sleep. The house was quiet. Ryan had fallen asleep beside a sketchbook filled with more of those fluid, fearless drawings. Dominic sat alone in the living room, watching the flames curl inside the gas fireplace, thinking about all the things he hadn't seen. Not because they weren't happening, but because he hadn't known where to look. Nora had been here for weeks. She didn't advertise, didn't demand. She just showed up. Again and again. Sunday morning, Dominic made a decision. He woke up early and wandered into the backyard, while Nora and Ryan were setting up another obstacle course with empty milk cartons and strips of painter's tape. Nora looked up, startled. He held up a hand. "Don't stop. I just want to watch." Ryan looked uncertain at first, but then grinned. Nora nodded once, then turned back to Ryan. "All right, showtime." Dominic sat on the edge of the steps, quiet, letting the moment breathe. Ryan moved through the course slowly but confidently. When he struggled, Nora coached. When he hesitated, she modeled. There was no pressure, no timeline, just effort, just trust. And beneath it all, Dominic began to see it, the quiet brilliance in her approach, the science beneath the simplicity, the strategy behind the improvisation. This wasn't chance, it was art. Over the next few days, Dominic found himself lingering longer, not out of obligation, but out of something else, guilt, maybe hope. He watched Nora adapt each day to Ryan's mood, his energy, his body. She never repeated an exercise exactly. She challenged him when he needed pushing, and softened when he showed signs of fatigue. And Ryan responded to her like gravity. He was laughing more, talking more, drawing with color. He even joked at dinner. "Dad," he said one night, "Miss Nora says my legs are made of springs. What do you think?" Dominic nearly choked on his water. He looked at his son, so alive, so curious, and then at Nora, who was quietly gathering dishes without looking up. "I think Miss Nora's right," Dominic said. Ryan grinned, and Dominic felt something click loose in his chest. Maybe he'd been blind. Maybe he'd been scared. But he wasn't anymore. He was watching. And for the first time in a long time, he was learning. The sun was low, casting a soft gold over the lawn as Ryan stepped out barefoot onto the grass. Nora followed behind him, carrying 2 rolled-up towels and a pair of plastic cones. She placed them in the yard. Nothing fancy, nothing clinical, just enough to mark a small path. Dominic watched from the patio, silent. He hadn't said much all morning. Something about today felt different. Ryan was unusually focused, and Nora hadn't said a word of encouragement yet. She just gave him space, trusted him to begin, and Ryan did. He picked up one crutch, then the other, and placed them aside carefully, deliberately, like he knew what came next would be different. Then he looked ahead at the line of cones, and stepped. It was small, barely a shift forward, but his foot landed, then the other. He wobbled, arms outstretched, but didn't fall. Another step, unsteady, then another. 3 steps, 4, then 5. Dominic stood, heart slamming in his chest. "Miss Nora!" Ryan shouted mid-stride, eyes wide. "Did you see that?" She turned in time to see his 6th step and caught him gently when he swayed. "I saw it, baby," she whispered, crouching beside him. "I saw every second." Ryan beamed. Dominic didn't know he'd moved, but he was halfway across the yard now. He knelt down slowly beside them, his hands trembling. I don't know what to say," he breathed, eyes locked on his son's flushed face. "Ryan, that was—" "Walking," Ryan said softly, still catching his breath. "I walked." Nora gave him a towel to wipe his forehead and turned to Dominic. "He's been ready," she said gently. "His body, his balance. It was there. He just needed someone to believe it was possible." Dominic swallowed hard. Emotion caught in his throat like a knot. All those years of specialists, all those late-night sessions with surgeons and neurologists, their voices thick with restraint. All those charts that said unlikely, limited, delayed. But none of them had seen this, not like Nora had. He looked at her, really looked, and then whispered, "Thank you." She nodded, eyes soft. "He did the work." "You showed him how?" "No," she said. "I just reminded him he could." Dominic let the moment sit in the quiet. The garden held its breath. Somewhere a bird chirped. Ryan leaned back against Nora's knee, tired but glowing. Dominic sat beside them, knees in the grass, hands on his lap like a child who didn't know what to do next. "I've been so afraid," he admitted. Afraid of pushing too hard. Afraid of hoping. Nora didn't answer. She just listened. "And I think I stopped seeing him for who he is. I only saw what he lost." "That's grief," she said softly. "It doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like distance." Dominic nodded slowly. "You don't have to apologize," she added. "I do." "For what?" He looked down at his hands. "For disappearing." That night, the house felt not louder, not busier, but fuller. Dominic sat at the kitchen island while Ryan told him every detail of his backyard walk, sketchbook open between them, Nora quietly making dinner a few feet away. "She says puddles make you stronger," Ryan said, giggling. Dominic smiled. "Is that so? Because you gotta balance and not slip." "Makes sense." "She said next week I might climb the porch steps. I'm gonna do it, Dad, I swear." Dominic reached over and tousled his son's hair. "I believe you." Ryan's eyes sparkled. That was all he'd wanted to hear. Later, after Ryan had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, Dominic stood at the glass doors, looking out at the cones in the grass. The towel was still crumpled beside them. He heard Nora step into the room behind him. "Do you want me to clean that up before I leave?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "Leave it. I like seeing it there." She hesitated. "You sure?" "Yeah." He turned to her. "I meant what I said earlier. Thank you." She nodded, the silence between them calm now. "I've been thinking," Dominic added, "about what you said yesterday, about presence, about belief." He exhaled slowly. "I think I've been arrogant, thinking the best doctors and top-dollar clinics could solve things, but I never asked what he needed. Not really." Nora said nothing at first. Then, "Sometimes what kids need is someone who kneels down and sees the world from their height." He nodded. "It's humbling." "It's supposed to be." Dominic gave a soft laugh. Nora stepped toward the doorway, gathering her things, but before she left, she turned back. "He's proud of you, you know," she said. Dominic blinked. "Ryan?" She nodded. "Even when you couldn't look him in the eyes, he still looked up to you." That hit somewhere deep. Nora gave a small smile, then disappeared down the hall. Dominic turned back to the glass, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was looking at what he'd lost. He was finally seeing what he still had. The next morning, the sky was soft and grey, and the house held a rare kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from silence but from stillness, peace. Dominic waited until Nora had finished tidying the breakfast dishes before speaking. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, not business low, personal low. Nora turned from the sink, drying her hands on a towel. "Of course." "In the garden?" She nodded. They stepped outside into the soft light, the dew still clinging to the grass, and sat, Dominic on the edge of a bench, Nora on the low step beside the planters Ryan had once abandoned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dominic broke the silence. "I've seen what you've done for him, not just physically, but whatever that thing is that makes him light up. And I need to know, how did you learn this? Not just the techniques, the patience, the knowing." Nora sat back slightly. "You want the real story?" "I want all of it." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then folded them in her lap. "Isaiah," she said softly. "My younger brother." Dominic listened. He was born early, cord-wrapped, spent his first 6 weeks in NICU. When he finally came home, The doctors said he might never walk. CP, similar to Ryan. He was 2 when our mom passed. A stroke. Sudden. I was 17, still in high school. Dominic's breath caught, but he didn't interrupt. They wanted to put him in the system, she continued. Said I was too young to take care of him. But I fought for guardianship, got it. Barely. And then I taught myself what I needed to know. How? Dominic asked quietly. Libraries, YouTube, old physical therapy textbooks from thrift stores. I watched how therapists moved, took notes, asked questions. I couldn't afford a degree yet, so I made one up from scratch. She gave a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. By the time Isaiah was 5, he was taking his first steps, against every prediction. I used kitchen towels, couch cushions, milk jugs, brooms, anything I could find. I made therapy out of survival. Dominic was silent. Not from judgment, but awe. I worked nights at a diner, took classes during the day. Howard University let me in on a scholarship. I graduated top 5%, got licensed, applied everywhere. And? Nora shook her head slowly. You know what happens when you show up to a downtown clinic with a Southside zip code on your resume, and braids you did yourself because you can't afford a salon? She met his eyes. They smile. They nod. Then they move on. Dominic looked down, ashamed of how familiar that sounded, how easy it was to believe potential only when it wore the right kind of polish. I kept going, she said. Opened a community clinic in DC, small but busy. We saw dozens of kids. Some walked for the first time. Some just learned to trust someone, but then funding dried up. Politics, grants pulled. The clinic closed. I lost my job, and eventually custody of Isaiah. Her voice caught for the first time. I wasn't stable enough, they said. He got placed with an aunt in Texas, still doing well, but I haven't seen him in 2 years. Dominic let the silence linger, let it mean something. You shouldn't have had to do any of that alone, he said finally. Nora shrugged. That's how it is for people like me. You learn early. There's the world you're born into, and then there's the one you have to carve yourself. He studied her for a long moment. The girl with the rolled-up towels and the open hands had once built miracles in the corner of a cramped apartment, while the rest of the world told her no. And now she was doing it again. Here, in his backyard, with his son. That evening, Dominic did something he hadn't done in years. He cooked, or tried to. Nora found him in the kitchen around 6:30, sleeves rolled up, a mess of pasta water and confusion surrounding him. Do you even know what you're doing? She asked, half laughing. No, he said, grinning. But I figured I owed you a meal, at least one. She paused. Is this dinner? Yes, he said. Sit, please. Ryan's helping with garlic bread, which means we're in real trouble. She hesitated, then slowly pulled out a chair. Ryan bounded in a few minutes later, apron askew and face streaked with flour. I told Dad he was going to burn the noodles, he announced. Dominic feigned offense. They're al dente. They're crunchy, Ryan shot back. Nora laughed, the sound light and rare. They sat together at the table, Dominic, Ryan and Nora, for the first time, not as employer and employee, not as therapist and patient, but something messier, something warmer. Something like family. They talked about school, about favorite movies, about how Ryan wanted to build a robot that could fetch snacks. At one point, Ryan turned to Dominic and said, Miss Nora told me once that therapy means healing the whole person, not just the legs. Dominic nodded, eyes meeting Nora's. She's right. Ryan beamed. After dinner, as they cleared the plates, Nora lingered at the sink while Dominic dried. I didn't expect any of this, she said softly. Not the job, not the boy, definitely not the pasta. He smiled. Me neither. You don't have to keep me here, you know, she added. You've seen what I do. You could hire someone more official, flashier credentials. Dominic set the dish towel down. I don't want official. I want you. She turned, surprised. You saw my son when I couldn't. You reminded him what strength feels like. And you reminded me what it looks like to care again." Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak. He stepped closer. "I don't know what's next," he said. "But I know I don't want to go back to what life was before you walked into it." Then, after a moment, she whispered, "Me either." And for the first time, it felt like the walls between them were no longer made of roles or fear or grief, just shared ground, hard-earned, sacred, real. The next morning, Dominic stood by the doorway of the kitchen, watching Nora cut fruit for Ryan's lunch. Her movements were steady, almost meditative, knife gliding, pieces folded neatly into a small container. She didn't notice him at first. "Nora," he said softly. She looked up. "Morning." He stepped into the room, still unsure of how to phrase what had been pressing on his mind since dinner the night before. "I want to offer you a permanent position," he said, her brow furrowed. "I thought I already had one." "Not as the maid," he said, "as Ryan's therapist. Officially, full-time, with full pay, benefits, everything you'd get at any top clinic." Nora blinked. Dominic continued, "This isn't charity, it's recognition of your skill, your impact, and of what I see when I look at my son now." She set the knife down, slowly. "I don't know," she said cautiously. "People already look at me sideways, being in a white man's house, raising his child." "You're not raising my child," Dominic said gently. "You're helping him heal." She hesitated, folding her arms. "I just don't want anyone thinking this is some pity project," she added, "or that I'm being kept here like something that doesn't belong outside these walls." "You belong exactly where you choose to be," he said. "And if that's here, then I'll make sure the world knows what you are. Not just a therapist, but one of the best." Nora held his gaze for a long time. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but I want a space. A real one. No more puddles and towels." Dominic smiled. "Done." Within 2 weeks, the spare guest room overlooking the garden was transformed. Where once there had been beige carpet and dusty lamps, there were now textured mats, resistance bands, a sensory swing, foam blocks, art supplies, light-up balance beams, shelves lined with colorful containers. Nora called it Ryan's room of yes. "No walls," she said, "no charts, no pity. Just space to say yes to his body, his story, his pace." Ryan was thrilled. The first time he stepped inside, his eyes went wide. "This looks like a superhero lab," he whispered. "It is," Nora replied, "and you're the test pilot." What followed were weeks of transformation, subtle at first, then seismic. Nora introduced sensory play with textured fabrics and weighted blankets. She crafted games that disguised motor skill drills as treasure hunts. She taught Ryan to name how his body felt, not just physically, but emotionally. One day, she placed a mirror in front of him and said, "Tell me one strong thing you see." "My legs," he said without hesitation. Dominic began spending more time in the sessions, quietly at first, just sitting on the floor beside them, listening. Sometimes he'd join the games, chasing foam balls or holding Ryan steady on the wobble board. And slowly, Ryan began to talk, not just to Nora, to Dominic, about things that had once been locked behind silence. His fears, the accident, even his memories of his mother. "She used to braid my hair," he said one afternoon, tracing a line on a sketch of her face. "She called me her little lion." Dominic swallowed the lump in his throat. She did. That night, Dominic found a note on his desk in Ryan's handwriting. "Thanks for listening, Dad." It felt good. School had always been a sore subject. Crowds, stares, eyes that stared too long. But one evening over dinner, Ryan surprised them both. "Miss Nora says I don't have to go back if I'm not ready, but I think I want to try," he said. Dominic looked up from his plate. "You sure?" Ryan nodded. "Only half days. But yeah." "We'll make it work," Dominic said. Nora smiled softly. "He's braver than he knows." That weekend, Dominic watched as Nora led Ryan through a confidence coaching exercise. She placed a line of tape down the hallway, and asked him to cross it while saying something bold. Ryan hesitated, then whispered, "I'm stronger than people think." "Louder," Nora said. He said it again, clearer, and again, stronger. Dominic caught the moment on video. He didn't post it, didn't share it. He just watched it once more that night after Ryan had gone to sleep, tears streaking down his face in the glow of his phone screen. That same evening, after the lights were off and the house had settled into sleep, Dominic tucked Ryan in and reached to turn off the lamp. But Ryan grabbed his hand gently. "Dad," he whispered. "Yeah?" Ryan looked up at him, eyes soft. "I'm not scared anymore." Dominic froze. He didn't know what to say, so he just leaned forward and kissed his son's forehead. "Me neither," he said quietly. Then he turned off the light, closed the door and stood in the hallway a long while, listening to the sound of his son breathing steady and free in the dark. The expo was held in a sleek glass building near the lakefront. Booths stretched from wall to wall, robotic braces, digital exosuits, state-of-the-art treadmills that monitored every micro-movement. Screens flashed, logos gleamed. Experts in tailored suits stood beside their innovations, ready to sell progress by the square foot. Nora shifted in her seat at the panel table, adjusting the lanyard around her neck. It read, "Guest Demonstrator, Pediatric Movement Therapy." She looked down at her palms. They were dry but tense. She wasn't used to being on this side of the display, on a stage, not in a supply closet. Ryan sat beside her, legs swinging from his chair, crayon in hand, quietly sketching the scene. Dominic stood a few feet behind, arms crossed, watching the crowd gather. "You okay?" he asked softly. Nora gave a tight smile. "I feel like someone's going to ask me what algorithm I used for sidewalk therapy with kitchen towels." Dominic chuckled. "Let them ask." The session began. Other speakers showed clips of cutting-edge interventions, 3D gait mapping, AI-assisted joint tracking. Then it was Nora's turn. She didn't have a slideshow. She had a video. Ryan, barefoot in the backyard, stepping into puddles, balancing on pillows, laughing, walking, and in the background, her voice steady and warm. The room went quiet. When the clip ended, Nora stood. She didn't speak like the others, with polished jargon or sleek delivery. She spoke from the gut. "I didn't have funding," she said. "I had a boy who wanted to move again. I had towels. I had belief. So I used them." There was silence. Then slow, growing applause. A woman in the front row, a pediatric neurologist, raised her hand. "What you've done is extraordinary," she said. "Do you publish anywhere?" Nora shook her head. "No time. I work." Someone else stood. "Do you train?" "No, but I could." Dominic stepped forward then, taking the mic from the moderator. "If anyone wants to know why my son can walk again, why he can laugh and climb stairs and sleep through the night without nightmares, it's because of her," he said, turning to Nora. "Not tech, not labs, her, Nora King." The applause swelled. Cameras flashed. A few reporters edged closer, scribbling notes. Nora stood still, stunned. She wasn't used to spotlights, but she didn't flinch. She just nodded. Once. Afterward, the three of them slipped away early. The attention was kind, but loud. Nora needed quiet. Ryan needed space. So Dominic drove them south, away from glass towers and clinics, into the neighborhood where Nora had first learned how to heal without a license, a grant, or permission. The streets were familiar to her, in a way no GPS could explain. The sidewalks knew her feet. The corners held stories. They parked in front of a modest brick community center. The sign outside was crooked, but the paint was fresh. Inside, a group of teens were gathered in the gym, playing modified basketball. One of them had a prosthetic leg. Another moved with crutches, but fast and confident. At the edge of the court, a tall young man called out drills. "Left foot, cross, shoot." He turned and saw Nora. "Sis!" Isaiah. He ran over and lifted her in a hug that almost knocked her backward. Nora laughed fully for the first time all week. Dominic watched them, something warm spreading in his chest. "You didn't say he was taller than you now," Dominic joked. "He cheats," Nora said. eyes still on her brother. Isaiah turned to Ryan. "So this is the legend," he said. "My sister's newest miracle." Ryan grinned, stepping forward. "I'm learning stairs." Isaiah held out a fist. "Respect." They bumped knuckles like old friends. Later, they sat on a folding bench outside the gym, watching the teens pack up equipment. "I started helping out here a few months ago," Isaiah said. "They needed someone who knew how to get kids moving without making them feel broken." Dominic looked around. "You built something." Isaiah shrugged. "I'm just continuing what she started." He nodded toward Nora. "She used to make me walk between cereal boxes in the kitchen, told me they were mountains." Dominic smiled. "She made me believe I wasn't less, just different." Nora swallowed, blinking fast. The sun was starting to set, casting soft orange across the blacktop. Dominic looked at her then, really looked, and saw it all laid out in the open. The weight she'd carried, the lives she'd touched, the quiet, relentless force that had lived beneath the surface of every room she'd ever entered. She wasn't just transforming Ryan. She'd been transforming entire corners of the world, quietly, unseen, until now. On the drive home, Ryan dozed in the back seat, a hoodie tucked under his head. The city lights flickered as they merged onto the expressway. Nora stared out the passenger window, arms folded. "You were brilliant today," Dominic said. She gave a tired smile. "Still don't know if the world's ready for someone like me." Dominic's voice was firm, but soft. "Then we make space." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "Whatever door you want to walk through next, we'll build it together." Outside, the skyline rose like a promise, and inside the car, something settled. Not just hope, but purpose. The auditorium hummed with chatter and restless energy. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, parents fanning themselves with programs, phones ready to capture every shaky performance. It was the annual elementary talent show, paper stars taped across the stage, the words "Shine Bright," painted in bold, cheerful letters. Dominic sat in the third row, his heart thudding in time with the faint thump of his pulse in his ears. His hands wouldn't stay still. Every few seconds, he checked the stage lights, the aisle, the edge of the curtain. He wasn't nervous for the other kids. Ryan. Backstage, Nora crouched beside him, her hand steady on his shoulder. Ryan was dressed in a light blue shirt and khaki pants, simple, but his favorite. His crutches were folded and leaning against the wall. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," she said softly. "You've already proved everything you need to." Ryan looked up at her, calm in a way that was older than his years. "I want to." "Why?" "Because I want everyone to know I'm not scared anymore." Nora smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then you go tell them." He nodded once, determined. The MC called his name. "Next up, Ryan Patterson, 2nd grade." The applause was polite at first, standard parent applause. But as Ryan appeared from behind the curtain, alone, no crutches, walking slowly but deliberately toward the microphone, the sound swelled. The room went silent. You could hear each careful step, each breath. Dominic's throat closed. Ryan stopped center stage, his small hands gripping the edge of the podium for balance. He looked out over the sea of faces. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "My name is Ryan Patterson," he began, "and today I want to talk about my hero." A ripple of curiosity ran through the crowd. "My hero doesn't wear a cape," Ryan continued. "She wears sneakers. She used to mop floors, and she taught me how to stand again." He looked toward the audience, and his eyes found Nora. "She taught me how to fall and laugh, how to walk through puddles without being scared, how to believe that my body isn't broken. It's just learning." A soft gasp escaped from someone in the back row. The teacher beside the stage pressed a hand to her heart. Ryan took a deep breath, his voice growing stronger. "My hero's name is Miss Nora King, and she didn't just teach me how to walk. She taught me how to be brave." Applause broke out, first scattered, then roaring. Nora covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. Dominic stood, clapping hard, not caring who saw the tears on his own face. Around him, the entire room was on its feet. Teachers, students, parents, all standing for a 7-year-old boy who had just walked into the world on his own 2 feet. After the show, the hallway filled with noise and movement, children laughing, parents congratulating, cameras flashing. Ryan ran to Nora and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You did it," she whispered, crouching to his level. He grinned. "We did it." Dominic approached, his expression caught between pride and disbelief. "You were incredible, bud." Ryan's face lit up. "Did you cry?" Dominic gave a half laugh, wiping at his cheek. "Maybe a little." Ryan turned to Nora. "You too?" She nodded, smiling through tears. "Definitely." Ryan beamed. "Then I did it right." Later that evening, after the noise had faded and the city's glow pulsed outside the windows, Dominic gathered Nora and Ryan in the living room. The house was quiet, except for the soft clink of glasses, sparkling cider poured by Dominic himself. "To you," he said, lifting his glass toward Ryan, "for every step that got us here." Ryan clinked his cup, grinning. "And to Miss Nora," he added, "for showing me where to put my feet." Dominic smiled. "Actually," he said, turning to Nora, "I have something for her." Nora blinked, confused. "For me?" He walked to the desk, opened a folder, and pulled out a document. The heading read, "The Nora King Foundation for Pediatric Movement and Play Therapy." She froze. Dominic spoke quietly, like he was afraid to break the moment. "I want to build something," he said, "in your name. A foundation. Real programs, real funding for kids like Ryan. For families who can't afford specialists or insurance battles or years of waiting lists. You'll run it, lead it, train others to do what you do." Nora stared at the paper, her mouth open, but no words forming. "I can't," she started, shaking her head. "Dominic, this is too much." "It's not enough," he said firmly. "You've changed lives without even trying to. Imagine what you could do if the world finally gave you the tools." Her eyes filled again. She looked from the folder to Ryan, who was watching her with quiet pride. "Miss Nora," he said softly, "now you can teach more kids to fly." That did it. Nora covered her face, shoulders shaking. Dominic stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her back. "This is yours," he said. "All of it. The credit, the name, the legacy. You earned every bit." She looked up at him, voice trembling. "I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," he replied. She took a long breath and nodded. "Yes." A week later, the press release went live. The photo showed Nora standing beside Dominic and Ryan, smiling, the foundation banner behind them. "A new era in pediatric healing," the headline read. The story spread faster than they expected. News outlets, medical journals, even talk shows. But none of that mattered to Nora. What mattered were the letters that started arriving at the house. Parents, teachers, kids, telling her how her story made them believe again. In the evenings, she and Ryan would read them together on the couch. He'd laugh at the drawings, stick figures standing tall, little hearts in the corners. Sometimes Dominic joined them, quiet, content just to watch. The woman he once thought was just the maid now had an office downtown, a team of young therapists she was training, and a growing movement spreading beyond Chicago. Yet when she came back to the Patterson house, she always took her shoes off at the door, walked barefoot through the yard, and checked the puddles after it rained. Because that's where it all began. One night, as the three of them sat on the patio under the soft hum of the garden lights, Ryan leaned his head against Nora's arm. "Miss Nora," he murmured. "Yeah, baby." "When people ask who you are now, what do you say?" She thought for a moment, then smiled. "I say, I'm a believer in puddles." Ryan laughed. "That's weird." "It's true," she said. "Every great thing starts with a small step and a little bit of mess." Dominic looked at them both, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. The boy who once couldn't stand, the woman who once wasn't seen, and the man who'd finally learned what it meant to stay. Together, they sat under the night sky, 3 stories rewritten by the same miracle. And somewhere deep inside that stillness, Dominic realized the truth of it all. Sometimes faith doesn't shout. It whispers and walks. 2 years later, the building stood tall on a quiet corner in South Side Chicago. Bright white walls, wide glass doors, a mural stretching across one side painted by local kids, feet, legs, wheels, wings. In bold blue letters above the entrance, it read, "The Nora King Institute for Movement, Play Possibility." Inside, the halls buzzed with life. Children's laughter, parents' voices, the quiet rhythm of hope in motion. But outside on this bright fall morning, the crowd had gathered for something more. The grand opening of the second therapy center, a community space, funded entirely by the Patterson family, built where Nora had once walked her little brother across cracked sidewalks between makeshift therapy drills. Now she stood between the two people who had changed her life as much as she'd changed theirs, Dominic and Ryan. Ryan was 9 now, taller, stronger, more himself. He wore a navy blazer, no crutches. His walk was confident, still deliberate but full of ease. A press badge hung from his neck, Junior Ambassador. He beamed at the reporters, shook hands with donors, and answered questions about therapy with the clarity of someone who had lived every moment of it. "Miss Nora says play is a kind of medicine," he explained to a local TV crew. "And medicine works better when you laugh." Nora stood back, arms crossed, watching him with pride that barely fit in her chest. Dominic, beside her, had grown softer around the edges. He still ran his company, though less often from the corner office, and more from a phone tucked into his back pocket, while walking the garden or helping with after-school homework. He looked at Nora now, that familiar warmth in his voice. "You ready for this?" She smiled. "Been ready for years. Just had to believe it was possible." He nodded. "And now you're building it from scratch." "No," she said gently. "We built it." The ribbon fluttered in the breeze, yellow and bright. The crowd quieted as Ryan stepped to the front, a pair of small scissors in one hand, his parents, because that's what they were now in every way that mattered, on either side of him. He looked up at the audience, then at Nora. "I used to think my legs were broken," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Turns out all I needed was someone who saw me standing." Gasps and applause filled the air. Nora's hand trembled as Ryan reached for hers. "Ready," he whispered. She nodded, tears in her eyes. He turned to Dominic, who bent low to meet his eyes. "Cut it, champ." With one clean motion, Ryan snipped the ribbon. Flashbulbs burst. The crowd erupted. And just like that, the doors opened. Not just to a building, but to something much bigger. The ceremony spilled into the afternoon. Inside, children explored the new therapy rooms, walls painted with colors that spark movement, not fear. There were balance swings, obstacle paths, sensory gardens, art stations, music corners, no whitecoats, no judgment, just joy. Nora gave a brief tour to a group of visiting physicians, explaining the core of her model. "Play, permission, and presence," she said. "Every session starts with what the child chooses. We listen to the body. We celebrate every wobble." "And what about data?" a skeptical doctor asked. She smiled. "We keep it, but we also keep their drawings." Ryan joined them mid-tour, proudly showing off his favorite spot, a wall of handprints. Every child who had completed a full therapy journey here added theirs in bright paint. "Mine's gold," he said, "because Miss Nora said I'm the first kid to come full circle." The doctor looked up. "And how are you now?" Ryan grinned. "I run. I help. I teach other kids how not to fall." Nora rested a hand on his shoulder. "He reminds us why we do what we do." As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned, and the three of them found themselves back outside, standing beneath the mural, watching the light shift across it. Dominic exhaled. "Feels like the ending of something." Nora shook her head. "No. This is a beginning." Ryan looked up at both of them. "Can we stay a little longer?" "Of course," Dominic said. "This is yours too." You think she even knows what we're saying? Cole didn't whisper. He smirked as he said it, swirling his wine like the silence across from him was proof of victory. What he didn't realize, the quietest person in the room wasn't the one he needed to fear. Because just a few steps away, holding a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc with steady hands and eyes like sharpened glass, Nancy Davies was listening. And she understood everything. The restaurant was called Veritas, private, gilded, cold, a place where deals were whispered over Wagyu, and billion-dollar empires changed hands between bites. It sat at the top of a luxury Manhattan hotel like a crown, glass walls, velvet booths, and a table so long it needed its own zip code. Tonight that table seated men with global reach and wallets to match, but it was supposed to be her knight, Yoshiko Shinohara, Japanese tech mogul, founder of Kaito Robotics, 45 years old, quiet, composed, a woman who built her empire without raising her voice and had no plans to start now. She sat at the head of the table like a stone in still water, no translator, no pleasantries, just presence, and that made the men across from her itch. Cole Harmon, CEO of Calix Global, was already losing patience. Next to him, Troy Beck, his silver-toothed second-in-command, was 3 drinks deep and twice as smug. They'd arrived expecting submission, smiles, signatures. What they got was silence, unapologetic, regal, sharp as steel. They mistook it for weakness. They mistook her for a formality to get through before the ink dried. They were wrong. And slipping between them all, barely seen, entirely overlooked, was Nancy Davies, 27, black, working a double shift in polished shoes and a burgundy apron that didn't belong in a room like this. She poured their wine, cleared their plates, dodged their stares. But what none of them realized, not Cole, not Troy, not even the maitre d' who forgot her name, was that Nancy had grown up in Sapporo. That Japanese wasn't just a language to her. It was muscle memory. It was the voice of her childhood, her identity, her mother's world. It was sacred. And tonight, that language, the one no one expected her to know, was going to become a blade. Because when Yoshiko whispered, soft and broken, "Is there no one here who sees me?" Nancy didn't hesitate. She didn't translate. Not yet. She heard her. She understood her. And somewhere inside, something cracked. A silence she had worn like armor for years began to peel away. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you. Sometimes power doesn't speak first, but it always speaks last, because before Nancy Davies ever opened her mouth, she had already changed everything. They called it a partnership dinner, but everyone in the room knew what that really meant. Control, wrapped in courtesy, dressed in custom suits, served with a side of A5 Wagyu and $900 wine. Cole Harmon leaned back in his chair like he owned the building, one hand wrapped around his glass, the other gesturing lazily toward Yoshiko Shinohara. "She even understand a damn word we're saying?" He chuckled, not with humor, with certainty. Troy laughed louder. "Doesn't matter. A $2.3 billion buyout for some silent robotics queen? I'll take it. Let her nod all she wants." Nancy Davies tightened her grip on the wine bottle. Neither man looked at her. They never did. She was just the waitress, a blur in their periphery. But as she stepped back from the table, she caught Yoshiko's eyes. Still, steady, unblinking. And behind that silence was something deeper. A quiet that wasn't passive. It was watchful. The Veritas room held its breath in velvet and crystal, 12 seats around a table that cost more than Nancy's annual rent. Cole sat at one end, radiating ego. Yoshiko at the other, radiating nothing. It rattled him. He wanted warmth, gratitude, deference. Instead he got elegance and stillness, the kind of stillness that made powerful men twitch. Nancy poured Troy's wine next. He didn't glance up. "Chop chop, sweetheart. Don't make me die of thirst." The table laughed. Nancy didn't. She tilted the bottle. Smooth, controlled. Her hands were steady, her face neutral. But inside, rage was threading its way up her spine, not just at what they said, but at how freely they said it. like nothing in the room could push back, like no one in the room could even understand. Yoshiko's translator sat 2 seats down, expression unreadable. He offered polite summaries, 1 sentence at a time, just enough to keep the illusion of civility intact. But Nancy was reading more than words. She was reading the room, the glances, the half-laughed slurs, the way Cole leaned forward and slowed his voice like he was speaking to a child. "You need to understand, Ms. Shinohara, this deal isn't just generous, it's a golden parachute. And let's be real," Troy added, "without our infrastructure, Kaito's tech will never scale." Nancy nearly dropped the tray in her hand, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. They weren't making a deal. They were staging a takeover, and assuming she didn't get it. She stepped back into the corner of the room, half-shadowed, half-lit, invisible again, but not deaf, not dumb, not passive. She'd been taught to listen more than speak, raised in Japan, where silence had meaning, where listening was an act of honor, where respect lived in the folds of language. And now, in this glass castle of arrogance, that language rose again, quiet, wounded, resolute. Yoshiko shifted slightly, tilted her head toward her plate, whispered something in Japanese. It was soft, subtle, almost lost in the hum of clinking cutlery, but Nancy heard it. "Koko ni sai wa mite kureru hito ha inai no ka?" "Is there no one here who sees me?" Nancy's throat tightened. She stood still, wine bottle in hand, heart pounding, mouth dry. She looked at Yoshiko, and for the first time that night, Yoshiko looked back. No one else noticed. Not Cole, grinning into his bourbon, not Troy, checking his watch, not the manager in the back, glaring at Nancy to keep moving. But something had shifted, a current. A signal passed between 2 women who had never spoken, but already understood each other completely. Nancy didn't know what she'd do next. All she knew was this: she couldn't stay quiet much longer. And when she finally opened her mouth, the entire room would hear her. Nancy Davies knew how to disappear, not vanish, not fade, just slip quietly into the backdrop. It was something she'd been practicing since childhood. In classrooms where no one sat next to her, in boutiques where the staff followed her but never greeted her, in job interviews where they loved her resume and hired someone else. You learned after a while to be smaller, not just in voice but in presence, eyes down, smile soft, movements efficient. Don't be the problem, don't be too proud, don't be seen. At Veritas, that was the entire training manual. Flawless service, no opinions, seamless silence. And Nancy had mastered it. But tonight, something was unraveling. She hovered just inside the kitchen doors, back pressed to the steel, wine tray resting against her hip. The sounds of the restaurant blurred behind her. She wasn't thinking about tips. She wasn't thinking about clocking out. She was thinking about that voice. Yoshiko's voice. Soft, fragile. Asking a question that didn't belong to the room, but still somehow reached her like it was meant for her. "Is there no one here who sees me?" Nancy had heard those words before. Not in sound, but in feeling. Sapporo, Japan. She was 8. Cold fingers clutching a thermos of miso soup at recess, her pink scarf tangled around her chin. The other kids hadn't questioned her skin. They didn't ask why her mother looked different or why her Japanese was flawless. They just accepted her. She belonged. Her mother, diplomatic, brilliant, endlessly exhausted, had been stationed there for 9 years. Nancy had learned honorifics before sarcasm. She bowed before she questioned. She absorbed the rhythm of language like it was breath. Japanese wasn't just a skill, it was home. Coming back to the States had been different. Suddenly, her fluency wasn't impressive. It was unexpected. Her experience wasn't international, it was interesting. And somehow she was always explaining herself. Too black to be a cultural expert, too fluent to be just a waitress, too smart to be overlooked, and still, always overlooked. Now, standing at the edge of that dining room, watching men in suits deconstruct a woman they didn't understand, Nancy felt something rising. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was recognition. Because Yoshiko wasn't being ignored by accident. She was being erased on purpose. Nancy returned to the room, slowly, carefully, mask back on. Cole was mid-rant about market shares and intellectual property. Troy was pretending to care. Yoshiko was silent again, but this time, Nancy understood what that silence cost. She collected an empty plate. Her fingers brushed against a document left open on the table. Fine print, legalese, predatory terms wrapped in polished language. She didn't read the whole thing, but she saw enough. And now her silence wasn't just strategic, it was loaded. She moved to Yoshiko's side, clearing a dish with practiced ease. Yoshiko didn't look at her, didn't need to. Their eyes had already met once. That was enough. Back in the kitchen, Nancy's manager barked orders about pacing, wine pairings, dessert delays. She nodded on instinct, didn't say a word. But her heart was beating harder now. Her breath came tighter. Her hands trembled just slightly. Something inside her had shifted, the way it had years ago during a school play in Kyoto when a teacher told her, "Your voice doesn't belong in this role." Not because she couldn't pronounce the lines, but because she wasn't meant to stand center stage. Tonight felt like that again, only this time she wasn't 8, and this time she wasn't leaving the stage. Back in the dining room, the laughter had faded. The power had settled, cocky and lopsided. Nancy stepped forward, silent, polished, composed, still unseen, but not for long, because behind her quiet hands and waitress uniform, Nancy Davies was no longer just watching. She was deciding. And when the moment came, she'd be ready. The steak knives gleamed under the candlelight. Not a speck on the plates, not a crease in the linen, not a single voice raised. But the room was getting colder, not in temperature, in tone. The kind of cold that came dressed as formality, that moved through legal language and careful smiles, pretending not to bite. Cole leaned forward, elbows on the table, tapping a pen against a thick contract in front of him. "We'll handle the stateside rollout. You keep your name on the tech. Win-win." He smiled like he was doing her a favor. Across from him, Yoshiko remained silent. She picked up her glass, sipped, set it back down. That was it. Cole's smile thinned. Troy slid a second folder across the table. "There's an updated clause," he said casually, "just to clarify post-acquisition usage." Nancy watched from behind. She wasn't pouring wine now. She wasn't clearing plates. She was still, eyes locked on the document sitting just inches from Yoshiko's untouched dessert. Her manager would have snapped if he saw her pause like this, but he wasn't watching. No one was except Yoshiko. And Yoshiko's fingers hadn't moved. Nancy inched closer, her tray clutched against her chest. She didn't read every word, but she recognized the structure. A decade-long non-compete. An IP transfer clause so broad it might as well have said, "Everything she's ever invented now belongs to us." Buried in elegant font and phrases like efficiency, consolidation, and equity realignment. Predatory, dressed in politeness. Nancy had seen it before, not here, but in embassy meetings, in policy briefings she'd overheard as a child, in contracts whispered through diplomacy and disguised as generosity. This wasn't a merger, it was a silencing. Troy clinked his glass to Cole's. "We're practically teammates now." Cole laughed. Yoshiko didn't react, but Nancy saw it. A flicker, a subtle tightening at the corner of her mouth. The restraint of someone who knew exactly what was happening and exactly how little respect was being offered. Nancy took a step back, breathed, focused. Her instincts told her to stay quiet. Her training told her not to interfere, but her spine had gone rigid. She could feel it in her legs, in her chest, in her fingertips. That moment, where silence becomes unbearable, where watching starts to feel like complicity. Troy looked at Yoshiko and chuckled. "I mean, if there's anything confusing in the paperwork, I'm sure your translator can—" "Clarify?" Cole finished, flashing teeth. "We kept it simple, don't worry." Yoshiko blinked once, slowly. Nancy felt heat rising behind her eyes. It wasn't just arrogance, it was intent. They weren't miscommunicating. They were counting on miscommunication. Nancy stepped forward, just slightly. She wasn't sure what she was doing. She just needed to move. The translator sat still, hands folded. He hadn't touched the updated file. Yoshiko's hand hovered over it and then pulled away. Not out of confusion, out of clarity. Nancy knew that kind of pause. It was the pause before surrender. The moment you weighed dignity against consequence, the room hummed with false civility. A cage, polished, padded, perfectly lit. But still a cage. And Nancy Davies, the girl who wasn't supposed to exist in this space, was standing at its edge, pulse pounding, breath shallow, every muscle screaming to speak. Not yet, but close. So close. Because this wasn't just about a contract anymore. It was about power. Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? And who gets to decide what silence means? The wine was beginning to run low. Nancy felt it before she saw it. Troy's eyes flicking toward the bottle, then toward her, like she wasn't a person, but a button that hadn't been pushed yet. She was already moving before he made a sound. Almost. Snap. Fingers. Sharp. Quick. Dismissive. Hey, sweetheart. More of that Sauvignon. Chop chop. The words hit like a slap wearing silk gloves. She froze for a fraction of a second. Not long enough for anyone to notice, but inside, something cracked. Nancy walked to the table, her hands steady, her steps silent. She didn't look at him, didn't smile. She poured the wine slowly, measured. Troy didn't thank her. He never did. Cole kept talking, breezing through numbers like this deal was already closed. We've mapped out Phase 1, US rollout by Q4, EU by next summer. Assuming regulatory clearance, of course. He laughed at his own line. Yoshiko said nothing. Nancy refilled the glass. Still quiet, still invisible. But inside, her heartbeat was crawling up her throat. Troy leaned back in his chair, loose and smug. He cut his eyes toward Yoshiko and spoke louder now. Still no comment. You sure we didn't buy a statue? A couple of the other execs chuckled under their breath. Nancy's grip tightened around the neck of the bottle, not enough to break it, but almost. She turned to leave, and then she saw it. A new document slid halfway across the table. Different color tab, different font, smaller print. She caught a phrase. Transfer of proprietary algorithms upon signature. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to read the rest. They weren't buying Kaito Robotics. They were trying to own Yoshiko, erase her code, her voice, her future, with a pen and a smile. Nancy stepped back into the shadows, the wine bottle cold in her hand. Her manager was watching now. She could feel it. The side glance from across the room, the invisible leash pulling her back into line. But it was too late. Something had changed. Inside her, the dam was starting to buckle. And then Yoshiko spoke, barely above a whisper, in Japanese. Jenshu wo hanaseru hito ha koko ni inai no ka? Is there no one here who speaks truth? Nancy's breath caught. She turned, not dramatically, not loudly, just turned, toward her. Yoshiko was staring directly at her now, not past her, not through her, at her. Nancy stepped forward, a single movement, deliberate, controlled. She set the bottle down on the white linen tablecloth, both hands. Then slowly, and she bowed. Not the kind of nod people give when they're sorry to interrupt. The kind of bow that came from memory, from reverence, from something deeper than apology. It was the bow of someone raised in a culture of respect, and done being disrespected. Every fork froze, every glass paused mid-air, every man at that table went still. Troy blinked. Cole tilted his head like he'd missed something, and Nancy lifted her head, eyes forward, voice steady. For the first time all night, she spoke. Shinohara-sama, may I translate? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was electric, like the room itself had been rewired. Yoshiko's eyes didn't widen, she didn't smile. She simply nodded. Once, slowly, and just like that. The room flipped. Nancy Davies was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the waitress. She was a weapon, and her voice had just been unsheathed. Nobody moved. The wine stopped mid-pour. The knives hung in the air like questions, and Nancy's voice, calm, clear, unexpected, cut through the hush like silk slicing paper. "Shinohara-sama, may I translate?" Yoshiko's eyes never left hers. A single nod, quiet, measured. That nod shattered the room. Troy's mouth parted like he was about to speak, but no sound came out. Cole leaned forward slowly, like the table was suddenly unstable beneath him. "You speak Japanese?" he asked. Not curious, accusing, like her fluency was theft. Nancy didn't answer him. She turned back to Yoshiko, bowed once more, then stood tall. "With your permission, I'd like to interpret your response to their proposal." Yoshiko folded her hands. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. "Hi," she said. "Please." Nancy faced the table. 12 seats, 12 men who had spent the last hour laughing, negotiating, mocking, assuming. Her voice didn't tremble. "Ms. Shinohara would like to clarify that she has read every clause in the contract and that she understands fully." She paused. Eyes met hers, narrowed, blinking, shifting. She let the silence sit for a moment. She also requests the removal of the non-compete clause, the IP transfer provision, and the relocation restriction disguised under Section 14.3. The room cracked, right down the center. Cole reached for his bourbon but missed the glass. Troy leaned forward. Wait, what are you even—" "You buried it in sub-clauses," Nancy said, still even. "Language designed to be missed, unless someone knew what to look for." Her hands were steady at her sides. She found it. A low cough came from the translator, who hadn't moved since Nancy stepped in. Yoshiko gave him a single glance. He lowered his head. Troy recovered first. "This is highly inappropriate," he barked. "She's a waitress." Cole raised a hand. "Hold on." He looked at Nancy like she had just crawled out from under the rug with a secret he'd left behind. "Where did you learn Japanese?" "Sapporo," Nancy answered. "I lived there for 10 years. Another silence, this one heavier, more uncertain. "And I'm not just a waitress," she added. "Not tonight." The table seemed smaller now, the chandeliers dimmer. Nancy glanced down at the open document, so neat, so curated, and then back at the men who wrote it. "This contract doesn't reflect a partnership," she said. "It reflects a trap." Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. "And Ms. Shinohara deserves the truth. Not a translation filtered through diplomacy, but the truth." She turned back to Yoshiko. A softer bow. A private moment in a public war. "Shinohara-sama," she said in Japanese. "Do I have your trust to continue?" "Yes," Yoshiko replied. "Please, say everything." Nancy turned, not to explain, to reveal. Clause 9.4 allows for indefinite usage of proprietary software, without credit, without compensation. Clause 11.2 restricts her from developing future technologies without your written approval, even if she walks away from this deal. Every face shifted. Some flushed, some paled. The power was slipping, they could feel it. And Nancy was still speaking. "You're not offering her a partnership. You're offering her silence, disguised as synergy, covered in compliments." She stepped back, hands at her sides, eyes unwavering. "She says no." The room collapsed into stunned quiet. Cole didn't move. Troy sat back in his chair like the ceiling had dropped 2 inches. Nancy waited, calm, composed. She had more to say. But not yet. Not until someone else broke the silence. And in the space between what had just happened and what came next, you could feel it. A reckoning had entered the room. Silence stretched across the room. But it wasn't empty, it was loaded, with tension, with confusion, with something dangerously close to panic. Troy shifted first, reaching for a napkin he didn't need. Cole's mouth opened slightly, like he was still deciding between outrage and damage control. Nancy didn't flinch. She didn't backpedal. She stepped closer to the table. "There's more." No one told her to stop. No one could. Clause 12.1 grants indefinite license to all existing and future AI models under Kaito's umbrella, without attribution. Clause 15.7 restricts public commentary from Ms. Shinohara for up to 10 years on any topic related to the company or its technologies. She let that sink in. It's a gag order. And a theft, wrapped in flattery, hidden behind translation. Across the table, Yoshiko remained still, but something in her face had shifted. Her silence no longer looked cautious, it looked sharp, intentional, alive. Troy stood. This is a breach of protocol. She's not authorized to— No, Nancy interrupted. She's finally being heard. Her voice was still soft, but steel was threading through every word now. You didn't want a partner, you wanted a name, a face for your press release, and the second she signed, her voice disappeared. Nancy turned to Yoshiko again. The room watched, unblinking. Would you like me to continue, Shinohara-sama? Yoshiko looked toward her translator, then toward Nancy. Yes, she said. Please continue. Nancy reached forward and turned the page. One flip. That's all it took. At the top, in bold, retention of ownership rights, international clauses. Clause 18.3 transfers full control of Kaito's neural interface blueprints to Calyx, effective immediately upon signing. No option for reversal, no clause for retraction. She looked at Cole. You knew she wouldn't agree to that. That's why you counted on the silence. That's why you counted on her needing you. Cole stood now too, his voice tighter than before. I don't know what you think you're doing. I think I'm saying what no one else in this room had the courage to. Nancy's eyes didn't leave his. I think I'm translating exactly what she's too polite to say herself. Behind her, a quiet click. A small device slid onto the table, black, round, unassuming. Yoshiko reached forward and pressed play. A voice echoed through the room. Cole's. She won't read it, just nods and signs. Sushi doll doesn't even blink. Then Troy's laugh. Let's just get her to ink it and celebrate. By the time she figures it out, we'll own her code and her silence. Then static. Then nothing. No one moved. The chandeliers above them suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. Nancy watched as the men's faces turned colorless. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Everything was already loud enough. Yoshiko leaned forward for the first time all night, calm, collected, clear. She spoke in English. Now that we all understand each other, I'll be renegotiating. With her. She looked directly at Nancy. No one argued. They couldn't. And somewhere behind them, footsteps approached. Fast. Angry. Nancy's manager. Storming in with a voice already raised. And a consequence she didn't yet know was about to miss its mark. The room didn't breathe. The last words still hovered in the air like smoke. I'll be renegotiating. With her. Nancy didn't move, didn't speak. Her heartbeat filled her ears, but her body stayed still. It was done. The lie was exposed. The balance shattered. And then, the door slammed open. Nancy! Her manager's voice sliced through the silence, loud, angry, familiar. He stormed in red-faced, gripping a towel like a weapon and waving toward the table as if no one important was sitting there. What the hell do you think you're doing? Everyone turned, except Nancy. She didn't flinch, but her eyes dropped to the wine bottle she'd set down earlier. Still there, uncorked, undisturbed. A reminder of the role she'd just outgrown. I asked you a question, her manager snapped. Are you out of your mind? You don't speak in this room. You don't interrupt private business. She faced him now. Not defensive, not apologetic, just calm. He stepped closer. Too close. You're done. Turn in your apron. And get the hell out before you make it worse. The words hit hard, but they didn't land. Nancy had already left the version of herself that would have cowered. She just looked past him, to Yoshiko, to the woman who had hurt her. And that's when another voice entered the room, deeper, steady, measured. She's not leaving. Every head turned. From the shadows of a neighboring table, a man stood. Tall, dignified, charcoal grey suit, presence like gravity. Nancy blinked. She hadn't noticed him before. No one had. But now, he owned the space. In fact, he said, she just saved your entire negotiation. Cole's expression fell flat. Marcus? The man gave a slight nod. Marcus Bell, major investor, silent board member of Kaito Robotics, and apparently watching everything from the beginning. Marcus turned to Nancy. His tone softened, but never lost authority. Miss Davies, I've been listening, and I want to personally thank you for protecting the integrity of this company. He turned back to her manager, and I'm going to be very clear. If she walks out of this restaurant without respect, compensation, and protection, there will be consequences far beyond your payroll. The manager's jaw locked. She's a waitress. She's a translator, Marcus said, a cultural strategist, and after tonight, something more. Troy sat frozen. Cole looked like he'd swallowed glass. Yoshiko hadn't moved since she spoke. She didn't need to. The room had already turned in her direction. And Nancy? She was still standing in the same spot. But the ground beneath her had changed. She was no longer on the defensive, no longer shrinking. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't waiting for approval. She was being seen. Her manager backed away without another word. Nancy looked down at the apron tied around her waist. She untied it, folded it once, and laid it gently on the service station beside her, not because she was finished, but because she was ready. And when she looked back up, every eye was on her, not out of curiosity, not surprise, but recognition. Nancy stood in silence. No tray, no apron, no orders to follow. Just her breath, steady in her chest, and the weight of 12 stunned men staring back at her like she'd rewritten gravity. Across the room, Troy reached for his bourbon with a trembling hand. He missed the glass. Cole had stopped blinking entirely, and her manager, gone, disappeared through the service doors without a word. Marcus Bell stepped closer, still calm, still composed. Miss Davies, he said, you've done more in 10 minutes than this team managed in 2 months. Nancy said nothing. She wasn't used to being praised out loud, especially not in rooms like this. But something in Marcus's tone made it land differently, not performative, not patronizing, genuine. You didn't just translate words, he said. You protected intent. You preserved dignity. You saw what no one else bothered to. Then he turned to Yoshiko. Miss Shinohara, your move. Yoshiko stood, for the first time all night. She didn't adjust her sleeves. She didn't clear her throat. She simply stepped forward, graceful, grounded, until she was standing beside Nancy. Then, with every man still watching, she reached out and gently took Nancy's hand. You saw me, she said, when no one else would. A pause. Then softly, would you allow me to return the favor? Nancy blinked. The room disappeared. Just her and Yoshiko now, the woman she'd once only served from a distance, now standing beside her, like an equal. Yoshiko turned to Marcus. Extend her a formal offer. He nodded. With pleasure. Then to Nancy. How would you feel about joining Kaito Robotics as an executive liaison and cultural strategist? A silence. But this time it was warm, alive. Relocation included, Marcus added. Tuition assistance, housing, 6-figure salary. Nancy's lips parted. She tried to speak. But nothing came. Not at first, because for so long her voice had been buried under everyone else's, but now it returned, shaky, small, but hers. I'd be honored. No one clapped, no one dared. The same men who had laughed at her, snapped their fingers, ignored her presence, now watched her walk out of the service corner and she didn't raise her chin, didn't gloat, didn't boast. She simply moved, with quiet certainty, with the dignity she had always carried, now finally reflected back. Yoshiko walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside her, and in that polished glass dining room where contracts were once written to erase, a new chapter had just been signed, one without ink, one with intention. And every man at that table could do nothing but watch, The dining room felt different now, not quieter, stiller, like the air itself understood something had shifted. Nancy stood in the middle of it. No tray, no apron, no more pretending. Just her, and the silence she now owned. Yoshiko hadn't let go of her hand. She didn't need to. The gesture wasn't for optics, it wasn't theater, it was truth. For the first time in hours, Nancy wasn't moving plates or reading documents. She wasn't interpreting contracts or translating power plays. She was simply standing still, and still the room revolved around her. Marcus Bell cleared his throat gently. "We'll send a formal letter," he said, "but the position is yours if you want it." Nancy looked at him, then at Yoshiko, whose face held no pressure, only clarity, only calm. "Executive liaison," Marcus continued. "Full relocation. Flexible start date. We'll cover the remainder of your graduate program, wherever you choose to attend." He paused. "Salary starts at 180. For a moment, Nancy didn't speak. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't trust her voice not to shake. She looked at her hands, still open at her sides, no longer clenching anything. Then she looked at the table, at the men who hadn't said a word since she spoke. Cole's face was blank. Troy's jaw was set tight. They didn't speak now because they couldn't, because they knew. This wasn't just an offer. It was a reckoning. Nancy inhaled slowly, then met Yoshiko's gaze. "Shinohara-sama," she said softly. "Your voice deserves to be heard, and so does mine." She turned back to Marcus, finally steady. "Yes," she said. "I accept." Yoshiko gave the smallest of nods, not ceremonial, not scripted, a gesture of deep, mutual respect. Nancy bowed. Not as a server, not as a translator, as a woman, as a force. They began to walk toward the exit, together, step by step, shoulder to shoulder. Each footfall sounded louder than it should have. Or maybe that was just the silence they left behind, the same silence that once erased her, now parted for her. At the door, Nancy paused, not to look back, but to breathe, to feel it. The weight that had been on her shoulders for years, gone. She didn't need to be loud. She didn't need to make a scene. She'd already done the one thing no one expected. She stood her ground and changed the ending. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. Yoshiko followed. And as the doors slid shut behind them, the dining room stood frozen. No applause, no recognition, just the echo of something irreversible. The story of a woman they tried to erase, walking out beside one they never truly saw, and rewriting the future with every step. Sometimes the ones you overlook are the ones rewriting the ending. He had accepted it, that his daughter would never walk, that no amount of money or medicine could change what the doctors said. But that morning when he came home early, he heard a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. And when he opened the nursery door, what he saw broke him. His daughter was in the air. Her legs were moving. And the maid, just the maid, was holding her like a promise God hadn't forgotten. Frank Hudson didn't plan to come home that morning. The meeting in Seattle had fallen through. The roads were quiet, the fog low. He didn't even tell his driver. He just drove. The house was still the same glass, marble, silence. Big enough for 20 people. Empty enough for grief to echo through the halls. He stepped inside, dropped his keys. No voices, no footsteps. Just the usual stillness. Until he heard it. A sound. Faint at first. Then clearer. Laughter. High. Joyful. Childlike. Frank froze. He hadn't heard that sound since the day she was born. He walked slowly up the stairs. Not rushing, not breathing. Drawn forward by something he couldn't explain. When he reached the nursery door, it was slightly open. And inside, Sharon the maid lay on the floor. On her back, feet in the air, holding his daughter high above her. Diana was laughing. Alive. And her legs, the legs he'd been told would never move, were kicking. Small, shaky, but real. Frank leaned into the doorframe like he might fall. He didn't speak. He didn't cry out. But something in him broke. The part that had stopped believing. The part that buried his wife and gave up on God. The part that turned his home into a machine and called it safety. In that moment, watching a maid do what science never could, Frank realized God had never left. He had just been waiting for him to come home. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stopped believing? Have you ever accepted the pain because it hurt too much to keep hoping? If this story touches you, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from, because someone out there needs to hear what you're about to see. That miracles don't always come through money. Sometimes they come through maids, mercy, and the quiet whisper of God saying, "I haven't forgotten you." Frank didn't tell anyone he was coming home. The meeting had been cancelled. The pitch didn't go well. So he drove. No driver, no music, just the sound of tires on wet road, and a kind of silence he'd gotten used to. When he pulled into the driveway, the house stood still. Big, quiet, cold. He stepped inside, put his keys on the table, took a breath. He wasn't sure why it felt heavier that day. Maybe it was the fog outside. Maybe it was the memories that seemed to linger in the walls. Or maybe it was just one of those mornings. Nothing moved. Just the usual stillness. The kind you stop noticing after a while. And then, a sound. Faint, light. A kind of laugh that didn't belong in this house anymore. He stopped walking, tilted his head. There it was again. Laughter. Soft, real. Not from a screen. Not from a memory. It was coming from upstairs. He didn't rush. He just listened. And with every step he took, the sound grew clearer. He reached the room at the end. The nursery. The door was half open. He hadn't been in there much lately. But what he saw, the moment he looked in, stopped everything inside him. Sharon, the maid, flat on her back on the carpet. And above her, Diana, held up by Sharon's feet, arms wide, face glowing, laughing from the center of her little chest. Frank froze. She was moving. Her legs, the ones every doctor said were finished, they were kicking. Tiny, unsure, but they were moving. Sharon was singing something soft. He couldn't hear the words, but it didn't matter. Diana was laughing. Not a giggle. Not forced. Real, full joy. Frank didn't know when his hand touched the doorframe, or when his eyes began to sting. He didn't even breathe. He just watched. And everything in him, all the years of silence, the appointments, the reports, the acceptance, began to crack. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to let something through. He didn't say a word, didn't make a sound, because somehow he knew this moment wasn't his to control. It was a holy thing, and he didn't want to break it. His daughter was laughing, and for the first time in her life, she looked free. Not careful, not sick, not stuck. Just a child, flying in the air, believing she could. He watched as Sharon brought her gently back down, cradling her like she'd known her forever. Diana's tiny fingers reached up and touched her face, and Sharon smiled, like this was just another day. But to Frank, this was the first day. He had seen his daughter, alive. He tried to hold it in, the tightness in his chest, the way his throat burned, but he couldn't. Tears ran down without asking, and somewhere in the back of his mind, where God had gone quiet for a long time, a whisper rose. Something like, "I still see her," or maybe, "I never left." He didn't know for sure. He just knew something was happening in that room, something no specialist ever gave him, something no checkbook ever bought. He stayed at the door, watched his daughter laugh again and again, and for the first time since the hospital, he wasn't thinking about what was broken. He was watching what was waking up. And just before he turned to walk away, he heard Sharon's voice, soft and full. "Come on, baby girl. Fly a little higher. Frank didn't go back to the nursery that day. He stayed quiet, watched from a distance, then slipped away before they noticed. He sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring out the window, trying to make sense of something that didn't come with answers. He didn't even tell Sharon he'd been home. Not yet. He didn't know what he'd say. For hours, the image kept playing in his mind. Diana, mid-air, laughing. Her legs, weak but moving. And Sharon, holding her like she'd always known how. He hadn't felt that kind of hope in years, and part of him didn't trust it. Frank Hudson hadn't always lived in silence. Before Diana was born, his life was full of movement. He built things, broke records, raised funding rounds in his sleep. People called him a genius, a visionary. But when his wife died during childbirth, everything stopped. They said it was complications, said she was too weak, said they'd done their best. But in the end, all he had was a newborn daughter hooked up to more machines than any child should ever see. Born too early, too small, too fragile, and the silence began there. He remembered those nights in the hospital, staring at her through the glass, his hand pressed against it like he could will her to stay. He didn't pray. Not really. Just stood there, whispering things no one heard. And when they finally told him her legs were damaged, that she'd never walk, he nodded. Didn't cry. Didn't argue. Just accepted it. He went home, shut down the nursery they'd been decorating together, and turned one of the guest rooms into a private care space. The therapists came, the best ones. The machines arrived, quiet, expensive things that beeped and scanned, but nothing changed. She didn't move, not the way they hoped. And one by one, the specialists left, each with the same sentence. You'll need to make peace with this. So he did, or tried to. He buried himself in work, lived in airports and conference rooms, told himself it was better this way. He couldn't fail if he didn't try anymore. And then, 2 weeks ago, Sharon came. A quiet hire through an agency. No resume that stood out, no impressive titles. Just a calm voice on the phone saying she was good with children. He didn't ask questions, just signed the papers and moved on. He hadn't even spoken to her properly since the day she started. Only saw her in passing, a nod, a quiet, "Thank you." He didn't expect her to stay long. No one did. Most couldn't handle the silence, or the weight of a little girl who didn't speak much, or the stillness that filled every room like dust. But Sharon stayed, and she didn't just clean. She hummed while she worked, left the windows open to let the breeze in, started bringing in little things, a soft blanket, new books, paper butterflies taped to the walls. Frank noticed, but he didn't say anything, didn't know how. And now, he had no idea how to make sense of what he saw that morning. The next day, he stood in the doorway of the living room as Sharon folded laundry. She didn't look up, didn't rush, just kept working. After a moment, he spoke. "I was home yesterday." Her hands paused, then she folded another shirt. "I saw you," he said, "with Diana." She finally looked at him. Not nervous, not flustered, just steady. "You weren't supposed to be back yet," she said gently. He nodded. I heard her laughing. His voice caught on that word. Laughter. She smiled. "She has a beautiful laugh. I think it's been waiting." Frank didn't answer. The room felt still again, but not cold. More like something fragile had just been placed between them. "I don't know what I saw," he said quietly. "Her legs, they were moving," Sharon finished. "Yes, sir, they were." She didn't say it like a miracle. She said it like a fact. "You're not a therapist," he added, his voice sharper than he meant. She shook her head. "No, I'm not." "Then what were you doing?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "Loving her," she said. "Believing with her. Sometimes the body moves when it finally feels safe." Frank didn't respond, because deep down, he didn't know how to believe in that. Not yet, but something in her words stayed with him. Long after she left the room, he stood there alone, looking at the shirt she'd just folded, small, pink, with tiny stars on the sleeves. The next morning, Frank stood outside the nursery door again. He didn't mean to. He wasn't even sure why he'd stopped walking. But there he was, coffee in hand, heartbeat heavier than usual, just listening. Inside, Sharon was singing. It wasn't loud, just a hum, really. Soft and steady, like something she wasn't trying to perform. Frank could hear Diana giggling, a sound that didn't fit the grief he'd wrapped around this house for years. A sound that made his throat tighten. He pushed the door open. Gently. Sharon looked up from the rug, not surprised. "Good morning, Mr. Hudson," she said. Frank nodded. "You do this every morning?" "When she lets me," she smiled. Today, she was ready. He looked at his daughter, sitting upright, legs folded beneath her like they'd never betrayed her. She reached for a stuffed lion, then glanced up at him. Her eyes were bright. "Hi, Daddy." The words hit hard. She didn't say much to him these days, but now her voice was clear, like it had never been locked away. He crouched beside her, touched her hair. "You look happy today," he said. She nodded. "We're flying to the moon." He blinked, looked over at Sharon. "It's just a game," she said. "But sometimes games help the body do things it forgot it could." He stood. The moment felt too big to stay in. "Can I speak with you?" he asked. She gave Diana a soft smile. "I'll be right back, Moon Pilot." Then followed Frank out into the hallway. In his office, he poured 2 glasses of water. He didn't know what to offer her. He wasn't used to company that didn't come with contracts or titles. Sharon sat quietly, hands folded. "I want to understand what you're doing," he said. "Not because I'm upset, just because I've never seen her like that." She nodded, waited. "We've had the best therapists, medical teams, devices. Nothing worked." "I know," she said gently. "You've tried everything you were told to try." Frank looked at her. "So what are you doing that they didn't?" Her voice didn't rise, didn't defend. She just spoke with a kind of steady kindness that made him feel like he was the one on fragile ground. "Children don't heal when they feel like problems to be fixed," she said. "They heal when they're seen, when someone believes with them, not about them." "I'm not a doctor," she added, "but I've seen what love can do, especially when no one expects it to do anything." Frank didn't answer. The words unsettled him, because they felt too true. "My cousin," she said suddenly, eyes softer now, "was born with something the doctors couldn't name, couldn't treat. They said she'd never walk either, but we didn't listen." "What did you do?" he asked. "We played," she said. "We told stories. We made up kingdoms and quests and flying trees. And every time she kicked her foot, we cheered like the sky was falling. It took years. But one day, she stood up, just like that, and walked into the kitchen like it was nothing." Frank looked away. "You think this is the same?" "I think every soul wants to be believed in," she said. "And I think Diana's been waiting for someone to believe out loud." He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being the one who didn't have the answers. But in this moment, he felt it. The quiet pull of a truth he couldn't explain. "Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" he asked. "Because I didn't know if you'd want it," she said, without blame. "This house has been quiet for so long. I didn't want to break what you'd made peace with." That last line hit hard, because somewhere deep in him, he had made peace with it. With the silence, the stillness, the loss. But now, she laughed, he said, almost to himself. She laughed like she wasn't afraid anymore. Sharon smiled. "That's the first step. The body follows the heart." Frank stood still for a long time after she left the room. He looked down at the glass of water in his hand. Still full, untouched, like he didn't know how to drink from a world that was suddenly moving again. The house didn't change overnight, but it started to feel different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't full. But something had shifted. Frank noticed it in the mornings. The way the nursery door stayed open just a little longer. The way Diana's voice rose like sunlight through the walls. She was laughing more now, talking more, moving, not walking, not yet, but reaching, lifting, Tiny victories tucked inside, moments no one would have noticed, unless they were looking. And Frank, he was looking. He started waking up earlier. Not for calls, not for meetings, just to listen. Some mornings, he sat on the stairs, coffee cooling in his hands, quiet as the house around him, listening to the sound of Sharon and Diana playing. Sometimes it was singing, sometimes it was a story, but always it was alive. And that life made him ache in a place he hadn't touched in years. He didn't step into the room often. Not yet. He stayed near the edges, close enough to see, far enough not to be seen. Something about it felt easier that way. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, or fear, or both. One afternoon, he passed by the open nursery door and saw them. Sharon had placed 2 pillows on the floor, set a small paper crown on Diana's head, and was holding both her hands as the little girl tried to press her weight into her feet. Diana's face was tight with focus, but her eyes were shining. "You're stronger than you think," Sharon said softly. "You've got queen legs today." Frank stood still, and for a brief second, Diana looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to join the moment. So he nodded, smiled faintly, and walked away. That night, over dinner, Diana sat beside him at the table. Her plate had more on it than usual, and she was eating, slowly, but eating. Sharon sat across from them, silent and less spoken to. Respectful, present. Frank cut his food, took a bite, looked at his daughter. "You had a big day," he said. She nodded, chewing. "What did you play?" Diana glanced at Sharon, then back at him. "We climbed a mountain," she said. "I had to stomp on clouds to get to the top." He smiled, really smiled. The kind that comes without effort. "And did you make it?" She nodded. "I did," Sharon said. "I have cloud-stomping feet." Frank looked across the table. Sharon met his eyes just briefly, then looked down at her water. Something about that silence sat heavy between them. After dinner, Frank lingered near the hallway. Diana had gone to bed. Sharon was cleaning up. "You've done a lot," he said quietly. "With her, in just a few days." She looked up. Didn't speak right away. "She's the one doing it," she said. "I'm just here to help her remember who she is." He swallowed. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," she said. "But it is honest, and sometimes that's enough." There was something in her tone. Not cold, not warm, just real. He nodded, then paused. "You don't ask for much," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not here for much." He didn't know what that meant, not fully, but he didn't ask. Instead, he turned toward the hallway, and as he walked away, her voice followed him. "She watches you, you know, even when you think she doesn't." He stopped, felt the weight of that sentence sit on his shoulders. "Kids don't need perfect," she said. "They just need presence." He didn't turn back, didn't speak, just stood there in the dim light of his home, wondering when he became a man who didn't know how to stay in the room. That night, Diana called out in her sleep. Frank stood outside her door, not moving, not sure if she needed him, or if she was just dreaming. He waited, listened, and when she quieted again, he rested his head gently against the wall beside her room, eyes open, heart somewhere between what was and what could still be. Frank had stayed late on a call that evening. Investors, questions, projections, the kind of voices that filled his days but never touched his life. When the call ended, he sat in his chair for a long time, hands still on the keyboard, but his mind somewhere else entirely. It had been almost a week since he saw Diana lift her legs, almost a week since he heard her laugh like the sky had opened, and yet he still hadn't spoken about it. Not to his colleagues, not to the world, not even to himself. He walked upstairs slowly. The house was quiet. Dinner had come and gone. The halls were dim. As he passed the nursery, the door was open again, just enough to see through. Inside, Diana stood in front of Sharon, holding onto her hands, wobbling just slightly. Frank stopped breathing. Her knees were shaking, but her back was straight, her chin up. Sharon's voice was low and steady. "Push through your toes, sweetheart, just like we practiced. I'm here. I've got you." Frank didn't move. He didn't dare. He just watched. Diana's fingers tightened around Sharon's. She shifted her weight. One tiny foot lifted, then touched forward, then the other. Frank's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Diana took one more step, her body trembling with every inch, and then collapsed softly into Sharon's arms. And just like that, she laughed. Full, giddy, unafraid. "I did it," she said. Sharon held her close. "Yes, you did, baby girl, yes, you did." Frank stepped back from the doorway. He leaned against the wall, hand over his mouth, eyes burning before he even knew why. He slid down, sitting on the floor outside the nursery, trying to hold together something that was already breaking open inside him. He had watched years pass without this, sat through appointment after appointment where no one believed this would happen, watched his daughter fade into silence, watched himself disappear into work. And now, on a quiet night, with no medical team, no machines, just a child, a woman, and a bit of belief. She took 2 steps, and Frank was the one who fell. Later, Sharon came out with Diana in her arms. The little girl was asleep, cheek pressed against her shoulder, breathing soft and slow. She didn't see him right away. When she did, she stopped. Frank stood. His face said everything. No questions, no doubt, just awe. And something deeper. "She walked," he whispered. Sharon nodded. "She did. 2 steps. And she'll take more," she said. But not because someone told her to. Because she started to believe she could. Frank looked down at his daughter, so small, so brave. She didn't even know what she'd just done. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I don't know how this is happening." Sharon's voice was quiet, but full. "You don't have to know. Just don't stop it." He looked at her. Really looked. Not as the maid, not as the woman he'd hired to dust rooms and wash sheets, but as someone who had done the one thing no expert ever could. She had reached his daughter. "Thank you," he said. Not out of politeness, but from the very center of who he was. Sharon nodded. "You're welcome, but you don't have to thank me. Just stay close. She needs you now." He watched as she carried Diana to her room, and for the first time in years, Frank didn't go to his office, didn't turn on the news, didn't check his phone. He stood outside Diana's room and listened, not for movement, not for miracles, just for the sound of her breathing. And in that quiet, he smiled, not because he understood, but because he didn't need to. Frank didn't sleep that night. He stayed by Diana's door, listening, breathing. The silence didn't feel heavy this time. It felt full, like something sacred had happened, and he was too afraid to move in case it disappeared. By morning, reality came knocking, just like it always did. He made a call, quiet, careful, to his private physician, the one who'd seen Diana since birth. "Something's changed," Frank said. "You need to see her." Dr. Keller arrived the next afternoon. Professional, polished, clipboard in hand, questions already forming before he even stepped inside. Diana was shy at first, clung to Sharon's leg, eyes wide. But Sharon whispered something soft, and Diana nodded, then sat on the floor. "She stood yesterday," Frank said, his voice careful. "Took 2 steps. Dr. Keller didn't look surprised. He looked cautious. "Was it spontaneous movement or intentional effort?" he asked. Frank blinked. "She walked," he repeated. "We'll run a few tests," the doctor said, "just to get a clearer picture." The room filled with quiet tension. Sharon stood nearby, silent. Watching, Frank watched her. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue. But something in her face changed. Diana tried her best, lifted her legs, wiggled her toes. But the mood in the room was different. Clinical, observed, measured. She looked up at Frank. He gave her a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. After a few minutes, Dr. Keller closed his folder. "It's possible," he said carefully, "that what you witnessed was an isolated motor spike. Reflex, not function. Unpredictable. And likely temporary." Frank's heart sank. He felt it, the old language pulling him back, the way professionals wrap pain in gentle words. "So, it wasn't real?" he asked. "I didn't say that," the doctor replied. "But in these cases, it's best not to raise expectations." Sharon stepped forward, quiet but clear. "What about what he saw? What she felt? That doesn't show up on a chart." The doctor glanced at her, then at Frank. "Who is she?" Frank answered without thinking. "She's the one who helped Diana move." The doctor sighed. "Mr. Hudson, I know how badly you want this. But spontaneous recovery in cases like hers, it's extremely rare." "And yet it happened," Sharon said softly. The words hung in the air. Not defiant. Not loud. Just true. But Frank said nothing. And that silence, that moment, was where something cracked. Not between them, but inside Diana. That evening, Diana was quiet. No singing, no games, just quiet. She sat on the rug, holding her stuffed lion close, eyes distant. Frank walked in. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded, barely. He sat beside her, waited. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked suddenly. The question sliced through him. "No, sweetheart, no." His voice broke on the last word. She looked down. The man said it might not be real. Was it pretend? Frank reached for her hand, held it gently. "I saw you," he whispered. "I saw you fly." Tears gathered in her eyes. "Then why do you look like it's not true anymore?" Frank didn't have an answer. Not one he could speak. He had spent years living in logic, building certainty, funding answers. But now, when it mattered most, he didn't know how to hold the fragile thing that hope had become. He stood slowly. "I'll be right back," he said. He walked out, found Sharon near the back window, folding laundry. She didn't look up. He waited. "She thinks she failed," he said. Still, Sharon didn't speak. The doctor said it was just a reflex. "I know what he said," she answered. Calm, still. Then she turned to face him. But that little girl took 2 real steps. She moved because she believed she could. And now she's scared it was all a dream. He swallowed. "And maybe it was." Sharon shook her head. "No, Mr. Hudson. The dream isn't the danger. It's what happens when no one believes it's possible." He stood there, watching her, realizing maybe for the first time that this woman, this quiet, grounded, ordinary woman, was fighting for his daughter's future in a way no one else had. And he was still standing on the sidelines. The next 2 days were quiet, too quiet. No laughter floated down the hallway. No singing from the nursery. Just the soft sounds of a child retreating back into herself. Diana didn't ask to play, didn't try to stand. She lay on the floor most of the time, her favorite blanket pulled up to her chin, the lion tucked against her cheek. Sharon stayed close. Never pushed. Just stayed like steady ground beneath a fragile world. Frank watched it all from a distance, just like before, and the silence started to feel familiar again. Like the house was slipping back into what it used to be. That night, Frank stood in the doorway of his lab, the space he once believed would hold answers. It was clean, organized, machines lined the walls, tables with untouched prototypes, blueprints that once carried his last threads of hope. But now, he couldn't feel anything in here. Not purpose, not power, just emptiness. He ran his fingers along the edge of a metal frame, cold, unmoved. This room had been built to fix things, but not everything broken wants to be engineered back to life. Some things need to be held, seen, believed in, not solved. And suddenly, it hit him. He had never created a space where his daughter could grow, only one where she could be monitored, measured, managed. The next morning, he found Sharon in the nursery, quietly folding away a set of hand-drawn adventure cards. "What are those?" he asked. She looked up. "We made them last week. Every move she made, we gave it a story. One for every tiny win." Frank stepped closer. One card read, "Climbed the mountain of wiggle toes." Another, "Crossed the river of almost standing." Each one was drawn in crayon, some with Diana's handwriting. Frank picked up a card, stared at it. Something in his chest shifted, softly but completely. "She stopped believing in these," he said. Sharon didn't correct him, didn't rush to give hope. She just let the silence speak for itself. Frank placed the card down. "I want to change the lab," he said. She looked at him. "Into what?" He paused. "Something that doesn't need wires. Something soft, real, for her." Sharon waited. "You want help?" she asked. Frank nodded. "Please." By the end of the day, the machines were gone. Not trashed, not destroyed. Just moved aside. They brought in soft lights, rugs, a bookshelf of storybooks, a small swing that hung from the ceiling beam. Sharon strung fairy lights along the wall and pinned Diana's drawings in the empty spaces. A beanbag became a cloud chair. Pillows became stepping stones across lava floors. A mirror was added, low to the ground, so Diana could see herself move. Not for progress, not for proof, but for pride. When Diana came in that evening, she stopped at the door. Her eyes widened. She stepped forward slowly, looked around. "What is this?" Frank crouched beside her. "Your new room," he said. "A place to move and play and fly again." She turned to him. "Even if I fall?" His voice caught, but he answered, "Especially if you fall." That night, she asked Sharon to read her a story. Then, for the first time, she asked her father to stay in the room. He sat on the floor beside them, legs crossed, watching the light dance across the walls as Sharon read softly. Diana leaned against him halfway through, small, warm, trusting, and he let himself lean back, not into certainty, but into presence. Later, when the house had gone quiet again, Frank stood in the doorway one last time. The new room behind him, soft, glowing, alive. He looked over his shoulder. "Thank you," he said. Sharon smiled, but didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Some things don't need fixing. They need space to grow. And finally, Frank had made room. It had been 3 weeks since Diana took her first steps. Since then, there were more. Not every day, not always steady, but they came one after another. Tiny, trembling, but real. Frank watched each one like it was a sunrise. Soft, slow, sacred. He didn't miss them anymore. Because now, he was there. Sharon had started calling their mornings missions. Each day had a name. Stomp the Sunday, kick the clouds, reach the window. Every time Diana moved, it wasn't therapy. It was part of the story, and she was the hero. And for the first time since her birth, Frank wasn't building labs, he was building memories. On her 4th birthday, the sky was soft and blue, not loud, not showy, just kind the way the world sometimes is when it's trying to apologize. Sharon had been preparing something special for days. She called it the Meadow Walk. Not a test, not a goal, just an adventure. A path through the garden, 10 small stepping stones lined with flowers, leading to the wide-open patch of grass where the sun waited. Diana stood at the edge of it, wearing a pink sweater and a crown made of paper and ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were bright. Frank stood a few steps behind her, not leading, not hovering, just there. Sharon knelt beside her. "You don't have to make it to the end," she said. Just take it one stone at a time. Diana nodded. The wind moved gently through the trees. The garden held its breath. She stepped forward. 1 foot, then the other. The first stone, then the next. Frank didn't speak. His hands were at his sides, open. He wasn't ready to catch her. He was ready to let her go. By the 4th stone, Diana's arms were shaking, but she kept moving. By the 6th, her knees wobbled. Frank took a small step forward, but Sharon held up a hand, gentle, steady. "Let her finish her story," she whispered. On the 7th stone, Diana paused, looked back. "Daddy," she called. Frank stepped closer, kneeled down so she could see him fully. "I'm right here," he said. "You've got this." And then, with a tiny breath, she turned back and walked. The 8th, the 9th, and then, on the 10th stone, her foot missed slightly. She stumbled forward, falling straight into the grass, and she laughed. A laugh so full, so light, it pulled the whole sky down with it. Frank ran to her, not because she needed rescuing, but because he needed to be there. He scooped her up, holding her tightly against his chest. Not because she fell, but because she flew. "You did it," he said, voice trembling. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I walked all the way," she whispered. Frank nodded, his hand gently against her back. "Yes, baby girl, you walked all the way." Sharon stood nearby, watching with quiet eyes, hands still, face soft. Frank looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he didn't see the maid. He saw the woman who gave him his daughter back. He carried Diana to the porch, sat with her in his arms as she dozed off, still holding the crumpled paper crown in her fist. And for a while, no one said a word. Not because there was nothing to say, but because this kind of moment doesn't need many words. Just presence, just love, just breath. Later that night, after Diana had fallen asleep, Frank stepped into the nursery. The fairy lights glowed quietly. The crown sat on the shelf beside her drawings. He sat on the floor, not on the couch, not at the desk, just on the floor, where stories had been built, where miracles had happened. And for the first time in a long time, he prayed. Not with big words, not with desperation, just something simple, real. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up when I did. Thank you for sending someone who saw her when I couldn't. Thank you for giving her back to me." 6 months later, the house no longer echoed. It breathed. There were fingerprints on the windows now, crayon drawings on the fridge, shoes by the front door that didn't belong to staff, and a little girl who ran down the hallway every morning, shouting stories to anyone who would listen. Diana didn't just walk anymore. She danced. She climbed. She jumped, not high, not perfectly, but with joy that couldn't be measured in charts. The room that used to be Frank's lab had changed again. It now held low tables, soft rugs, and chairs made for small hands and growing hearts. Children came every week, some in braces, some in wheelchairs, all carrying the same sentence Diana once wore: "She may never." But here, no one spoke those words. Here, they played. Here, they tried. And slowly, step by step, they began to believe something different. It didn't happen with investors. It didn't happen with press releases. Frank never called the media. He didn't need to. Word spread through letters, parents, quiet circles of people who were still waiting for someone to believe with them. He called it the Story Center, because that's what Sharon had taught him. Children don't heal through instructions. They heal through stories their hearts can believe in. Frank stopped running his company full-time. He handed the lead to someone else and spent his mornings here, not behind glass walls, but down on the floor. Sometimes he tied shoelaces. Sometimes he just listened. But every day he showed up. One afternoon, Diana stood at the front of the room with a paper in her hand. She had drawn wings, colored them in soft blues and yellows, "These are my feet," she said, holding them up. "They were sleepy for a long time, but now they're awake, and they want to fly." The room clapped. Frank did too. And in the back corner, Sharon smiled. The kind of smile that knows its place. Not center stage, not in the spotlight, just there, where the light begins. They never fell in love, not romantically, but something deeper grew between them. A quiet, unshakable friendship. A trust built through the kind of storms that leave people changed. They didn't speak about it much. They didn't need to. Some bonds aren't declared. They're just lived. One evening, Frank sat in the garden, watching Diana race through the grass. She wore a cape made from an old bedsheet, and she kept shouting, "Come on, Daddy, let's fly." He stood slowly, pretending to groan. "These old feet don't fly like they used to." "Then run," she laughed. And so he did. Clumsy, out of breath, but laughing, really laughing. Sharon watched from the porch, hands in her lap, eyes soft. "She's not afraid anymore," Frank said later, as the sun dipped behind the trees. Sharon looked toward the field. "Neither are you." Years from now, when people ask Frank Hudson what changed his life, he won't say the IPO. He won't say the patents or the machines. He'll talk about a maid with no degrees and a child who taught him how to stand again. He'll say, "Not all miracles come in labs. Some come with crayons, with butterfly legs, and with someone who decides not to give up, even when everyone else already has." And if you ever visit the Story Center, you'll find a small sign on the wall near the entrance. It reads, "Healing doesn't begin with answers, it begins with love. Sharon Baker." And beneath it, a handprint in pink paint. Small, delicate, and full of life. Diana's.